Let's draw some fractions on this nice fraction paper I've got here. So I've got squares that are cut into 8 lines in the horizontal direction and 8 lines in the vertical direction. So if I look at one of these squares, I'm going to say let's call that a 1 by 1 square divided into 8ths. So there's 8 equal spaces along there. And we'll draw some fractions representing a half, a quarter, an eighth, various other fractions. Let's say here, just to start, that's the fraction 1 over 1. 1, right? So if that's 1, let's draw a half up here. I'm going to just shade the outline of my box, and then I'll cut it in 2 down the middle. Label it. So this was half the width and the full height. So a half was 1 times a half. Okay. Well, if I can do that, I can draw a quarter over in the next box here. A quarter is probably the first thing I'd think of is if I cut the box into 4 equal pieces again, and more than one way to do it, then just pick one and shade it in. So that's a half wide and a half tall. So that's a quarter. So I got that. You could also say you took the orange guy and you cut him in half, because a half times a half is a quarter. So a quarter times a half is an eighth. So we're going to cut this in half again. That little rectangular box represents an eighth twice. So it looks like, so here's a little bit of a pattern, right? So the whole was square, the half's a 2 by 1, or a rectangle, which is twice as long in one way as it is in the other direction. The quarter's square, the eighth is a rectangle. I guess the 16th is probably going to be square, so I'm supposed to cut this in half again, and the obvious choice, though not the only choice, is to cut it up the middle and make a little square, which is, well, it's going to be a quarter by a quarter. That's a quarter of the side length, right? But that's also 2 of these little helper lines. So somehow we're starting to see these little boxes are looking better now that our fractions are getting smaller. So that would be a 16th. If I want to cut this guy in 2, I'll get 1/32. And so I cut the square in half, and sticking with the same program, I guess I'll cut them, say, vertically. And now there are 8 helper lines along here, so I guess that would be an eighth. And this is still a quarter, so and then I can cut them in half again now that I'm getting good at that. Back to the square case. 1/8 by 1/8. 1/8 times 1/8 is 1/64. That's 1/32 divided by 2, or times a half. Get a black pen for the little guy. So that's just 1 out of these 64 squares on the nice paper. And so I think that at that point I will stop, because if I want to draw any smaller fractions, and of course I could take half of that and get 128th, and half of that would be 1 over 256, but then I'm going to have a hard time with these fat pens drawing it, and my little boxes are going to be too big.